My name is Dave Burns, and I am president of Midway Village Museum. Today we're going to be talking about the past, present, and future of housing. Before I get into that, though, I just want to make a few introductions. It's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. We have with us here Brad Bruce, retired executive director of Zion Development. Next to him is Earl Dotson, chief of communications for the Rockford Public School District. To his left is Ron Kluwer, CEO of Rockford Housing Authority. To Ron's left is Mike Brown, CEO of the YMCA of the Rock River Valley and a team leader for Transform Rockford. And then to his left is Tim Hoffman, Vice President of the Rockford Apartment Association. And then our moderator is Chuck Sweeney, columnist for the Rockford Register-Star.
This is a very, very gross simplification of how we got to where we were. In my neighborhood, and I live in the Midtown District, our neighborhood used to be kind of like this about 100 years ago, and even before the end of the Second World War, where we had churches and schools and mixed income housing. However, after the Second World War, those of us who are baby boomers are the result of the need for a tremendous amount of new housing. We made decisions on how to do that based almost entirely on economics, without consideration of the unintended social consequences of that. And when the new housing was developed, it was developed with the idea of, well, let's be efficient and let's develop it on the outskirts of town. So the housing moved out, and with the housing went the money. The consequence of that, of course, was that we disinvested from the centers of our cities. They, of course, suffered the consequences of that. I think the key thing to remember in the history of our housing in our country is it was driven almost exclusively by economic motives, without consideration of the unintended social consequences. The other thing is to say this: housing is perhaps one of the most complex social policy and economic policy topics that there is.
Fair housing simply means everybody should have equitable access to housing. Doesn't matter if you're black or white, male or female, rich or poor, and we know that in the community that's not the case. In fact, as a result of Newtown, the federal government opened an investigation into the city to see if we were violating civil rights. They sent shoppers out to the South Newtown neighborhood to determine would black residents seeking rental units or for sale units be treated the same as white residents. And last summer, 10 out of 10 black residents were treated differently than 10 out of 10 white residents.
In the lower income side of things, they do not value education. They really don't. And this is probably going to be, I'm going to probably be looked down on, but poor people make poor decisions. They're poor for a reason, because they make poor decisions. End of story. That's what it really comes down to.
Poor kids are born in those situations.
Right. And the parents...
So poor kids didn't ask for that situation.
No, right. But the parents don't encourage education. They don't encourage even going to school sometimes.
I think that's a perception.
It always frustrates me to hear perception. I'm aware of it. I understand how people feel, but the comment that poor people make poor decisions is inaccurate. And when we think about people who are in poverty, we just automatically assume that those are our criminals. Those are the folks that don't want to work. They don't want to get an education, and it's absolutely untrue.
There's a lot of evidence in trauma-informed care that when you consider the words you're using, talking about particular groups of people, poor folks have real challenges to overcome.
Did you actually say that poor people make poor decisions?
Yes.
That's a very ignorant statement to me. I can use myself as an example. I lived in Jane Addams with 3 boys and 1 girl, and my whole message to them was, you gotta get an education.
I didn't say all poor people make poor decisions. I said poor people do make poor decisions. I'll stand by
so does rich people.
Right, they do. You're right.
I worked 3 jobs to take care of my children, and it just pains my heart for people to judge me by the color of my skin.
People's judgments are driven by their value systems. That works most of the time until you get down to the basic level where basic needs need to be met.
This idea that poor people make poor decisions just did not sit well with me. One of the things that I often try to figure out is how we mobilize and engage people in the community like this gentleman was speaking to, in terms of individuals like himself and me that are not showing up. For reasons like poor people make poor decisions is why you don't get the mobilization and energy from people that need to be a part of a forum like this. When I go to these forums, the people that need to be here aren't. That's my frustration, is like, what are we doing in order to get the people that need to be here so they can be heard? I have never worked with anyone, and I said this, I've never worked with anyone that woke up and said, I don't want to have any lights today, gas today, I don't want to be able to feed my children. So those kind of comments is what discouraged the community from coming together.
It still surprises me today when people say all these different things about the Grove and South Newtown and the reasons they believe that development was done as opposed to the realities of why it was done.
My understanding is what you built there right now, you haven't put basements in there because you're aware of the fact how easily that area will flood. We were told that they were too poor to have garages, and they didn't need garages or parking spaces. It was basically, we're putting it in, we're going to put it in the newspaper that everybody there are racist, and that's not true. That neighborhood was coming back on its own. People were moving back in there. I lived with a Vietnamese neighbor down the street. The minute that hit, you have massive white flight out of there.
We did not put basements in there not because the area floods. We did not put basements in there because most multifamily does not have basements when you're doing a rental product. Most do not. So there's a misperception there on flooding. There also was significant study done on the area of that site that does flood, and nothing is built in there. It's a recognized floodway. We also put significant investment into stormwater runoff control. Nobody said and believes that everybody who attended the Gregory School meeting or lives in Newtown is racist. That's an untrue statement. What I can tell you is there are folks who were, and there are folks who are very concerned about their property values. There are folks who are very concerned about change. And I can tell you, having been in 20 years of real estate development, it doesn't matter if we're building affordable housing or you're putting a Myers on Perryville. Folks fear change in their neighborhood. The comments about, I heard you didn't put basements because the area floods. I heard, you didn't give them garages because they're poor and they can't afford cars. There's a lot of that, perception and misperception out there in the community. I think there are really good reasons to have dialogues like these so we can get past those and ultimately get the truth on the table. Because unfortunately, rumor doesn't really answer questions in a way that's factual, it's sensational.
Rockford has always been known as a community of homeowners. Millennials are just coming to the age where they are buying houses. How do we encourage young people to buy houses?
In talking to millennials, I think a key word is incentivize. I think it's different the way they think about housing and home ownership.
Millennials are really just now approaching that time where they're getting secure in their jobs and quite honestly haven't purchased yet. And if we have patience, the numbers are there. When we think of this generation, this is the generation that watched their parents lose their jobs. I think a lot of our millennials are cautious in not making those decisions.
There was a time when it used to be considered a great investment, but now people see it just doesn't seem as good of a deal as it used to be to own a home for young folks.
Affordable goes back to the conversation we had before. There's a definition for affordable housing. It means that your costs related to housing, whether it's purchase or rent, are going to be 30% or less of your income. So ultimately what we find, we have to find a way to talk differently about it, is sometimes we just have some cheap and crappy housing in our community, and there are folks who can't afford that, and it's still not affordable. So there's an overall economic issue if we're putting folks in unhealthy housing that we really need to think about.
You know, I just want to comment that a lot of what we're talking about is what we're going to do or what we need, and part of the problem is that kids, they don't have as much bias as we do as adults. It's adults that I'm seeing argue about where we're going to head.
You know, when we talk about perception of adults and we look at what people see and what their bias is, one of the things that I notice is that it's not kids who actually have this issue. Kids play together, they work together, they go to school together, yet when I look around, it's the adults that are arguing. It's the adults that are really causing the negativity.
It starts with our kids, led by parents, but we really need to get our kids to understand their opportunity in their community. Education needs to keep up with technology and help kids be innovative so that they know that they have security in the future.
I think the housing forum today was necessary. I think we need to have more forums of this nature.
You know, in my 25 years in Rockford, my 14 years before that, this is the first discussion I've been a part of that has been sort of community-wide about the values of housing. The first one. I never had a discussion like this with my board. You know, I'm sure they're not, you know, nobody's really happy about that, but this is wonderful. But, you know, housing is one of the most complex topics that there is. We're not going to come to easy answers on this. We have to spend a lot of time together, but if we don't, the social consequences are very not good.
I want to say thank you to AARP. They are our Connecting with History series sponsor. And then I also want to thank the Rockford Apartment Association for their support for this forum.